Hey guys, when I tackle these issues, if I've got a choice in how I'm going to tackle them, what I like to do is to talk about the controversy of the moment and then to talk about the more profound, underlying political and philosophical issues in a way that'll still be interesting if I come back and watch this video myself 5 years from now, 10 years from now, when the controversy of the moment has been forgotten. The controversy of the moment right now, really it's a long series of debates. Vegan Gains is right now engaged in a one-man crusade to debate every imbecile who makes excuses for eating meat on the internet and to scoff at and laugh at their ridiculous excuses and rationalizations for why they eat meat one at a time. So hey, shout out to Richard, shout out to Vegan Gains. Obviously, he is in large part doing this as a form of entertainment for his audience. It's not entirely serious, but of course there also is a serious message he's trying to deliver, to one person at a time. And of course he has a big audience, so in some ways it's reaching 100,000 people at a time. So obviously I respect the effort he's making, even though, quite honestly, from my perspective, I do find many of his arguments logically flawed and counterproductive and needlessly combative and creating hostility sometimes when he's debating with people who are actually inclined to not be hostile toward him. His debate with Andy Worski, as an example, Andy Worski began that debate as a somewhat humble ex-vegan, as someone who had tried veganism and felt it didn't work for him as a diet. Andy Worski began that with a really positive, fairly warm and conciliatory set of attitudes. And they got stuck into this ridiculous debate, ridiculous from my perspective, about what would you do if space aliens conquered Earth and if these space aliens began exploiting human beings, human lives for meat in the same way that humans exploit animals. I sympathize with why they engaged in that conversation. I understand the series of steps that led to that debate and why it took on that form. But yeah, I do feel that a lot of those debates are ridiculous. If you guys find them entertaining and enlightening, great. Obviously, a lot of people do. With that caveat having been said, the latest debate as of this moment is between Vegan Gains and a much more hostile, dismissive, and derisive character who's named in the description of this video. But it seemed to me really significant that in this debate, Vegan Gains was in the early stages, I think, tripped up and kind of shocked and had to deal with the unwanted assertion that vegans are inevitably and ineluctably killing animals by participating in grain agriculture, that by farming wheat, by farming other grains, by farming rice or what have you also, we are constantly killing animals, and that therefore veganism as an animal rights paradigm does not make sense. Now this critique, it actually does cut pretty deep, and I've seen vegans respond to it across the board. I have seen Gary Francione struggle to deal with this, because Gary Francione, who's, by the way, if you haven't heard of him, he's probably the single most influential political theorist about veganism today in 2017. I think his views are now going out of fashion, but the last 5 years, I think he's led the most successful, the most influential school of vegan thought, the so-called abolitionist approach. I don't subscribe to it, but I recognize their success and how influential they've been. Gary Francione, even for him, this is really an unwanted and uncomfortable challenge. And ultimately, when Vegan Gains was discussing it, he ended up appealing to the idea of the ethics of intention. So, in a sense, Vegan Gains conceded that the difference between a vegan eating wheat and a meat eater eating a steak is not an absolute and categorical difference. It's a difference which, if measured in the number of animals being killed, the amount of suffering, or the amount of harm, that we can quantify, that we can think of as being on a spectrum. It's admitting that wheat farming is also killing some animals, even though obviously if you look at the full cycle of production, if you scale it up and do the math, all the ecological impacts as well as the animal suffering impacts or what have you, eating the steak is much worse. But where we are dealing with a difference of degree and not a difference of kind. I think it is really significant. I think it is really worth dwelling on and reflecting on the extent to which this issue of grain agriculture, the extent to which it is a shocking and unwelcome challenge to most vegans and most vegan schools of thought. Why do I emphasize that? Because it is not a challenge to my approach and my school of thought. I have a playlist, I'll give the link below this channel, below this video. I have a playlist here on this channel devoted to what I call the wildlife management approach to veganism. I differ from other vegans in many, many ways. I differ in not glorifying pet ownership. not glorifying, taking a dog and castrating it, domesticating it, turning it into a toy for human entertainment. I say, no, that is not the moral baseline. Taking care of your pets is not the moral baseline. We have to look at how that dog would have lived in the wild if it were a wolf. We can't look at photos of a cute little cuddly piglet, a piglet that has probably been castrated and domesticated and is being raised in someone's living room, and say just because it's cute that's the moral baseline. We have to look at a wild boar living in the forest, where indeed wild boars will attack and try to eat people. It's a very different approach that proceeds from normatively looking at how animals would live in the wild. But step 2 of this is that I completely concede the point that the concept of animal rights is a human-centered projection. I do not believe that animals have souls. I also do not believe that human beings have souls. I believe that human beings, in the same way that we create arbitrary legal distinctions and impose them on one another, we create arbitrary legal distinctions and impose them on animals. I think a really good example of this that almost everybody accepts, very, very few people would debate it, within the United States and within Canada, every state and every province has some legal standard for what's called the age of consent. And most people don't really care what it is. Maybe it's 18, maybe it's 16, but we know there is some age after which people can take moral responsibility for the decisions. What age can you drive a car? What age can you drink alcohol? Whatever the age may be, however arbitrary that decision is, we all accept the idea that ultimately human beings sit down and they draw a line in the sand, they write a law that establishes that barrier, and then we all accept it and we all live with it. We can debate what the age is, but we're not really debating the concept that at some point you're too young to drive a car, you're too young to own a gun, too young to vote, too young to pay your own taxes, and that conversely there's some point when you're too old to have another person take responsibility for that. You must take responsibility for it yourself. In the same way, I think it is completely arbitrary that human beings sit down and they draw a line on the map and they say, on that side of the line, we have a habitat conservation area. And over there, the rights of animals are protected. Whether it's a bear or whether it's gophers, ground squirrels, animals that would eat the food we're farming, whether they're rats, wolves, elephants, what have you. And then on the other side of that line, if the elephants come into the city, if the bears come into the city, if the rats come into your own basement, if the cockroaches are crawling on your own walls, we do not recognize that animals have rights. So this is the opposite of a model based on inalienable rights or a model based on the soul or the spirit of the animal or the animal's intelligence. I embrace the fact that these are ultimately arbitrary distinctions we create, and it is to some extent for the animal's benefit, and it's to some extent for our benefit as human beings because they're just human inventions. They're human inventions that ultimately have to do with the function of our own society. So ultimately, governments will sit down and draw lines on a map and decide over there we have grain farming and over here we have habitat conservation. Now this approach has really many advantages. I am not at all tripped up by these questions that trip up vegan gains because my approach to veganism is so fundamentally different, so fundamentally alien. I'm also not tripped up in any way whatsoever when, for example, meat eaters raise questions about the ethics of palm oil production. I've done videos about that in the past. I guess I can put a link below this video too. To me, what's fundamental is to get across the point, look, it doesn't matter if you're chopping down the forest to produce wood, or if you're chopping down the forest to produce palm oil, or if you're chopping down the forest to produce strawberries. Agriculture, absolutely all plant agriculture, is created and sustained through violence. Conceptually speaking, it's violence against the wild. It's an act of violence that reduces a forest to being a farm, and then is in a constant state of war against the weeds that try to take back that farm, the new saplings, the new trees that are trying to spread up. It's a constant state of war against the various species, whether you think of them as pests or otherwise, the various animals and insects and what have you that are going to come in and try to take back that farm. Ultimately, each of those animals is just trying to survive. Each of those plants is just trying to survive. But the effect of what they're trying to do is they're trying to take a totally unnatural human invention, the farm, and have it revert to being a forest or a grassy field to being part of the wild, part of the wilderness. That is what I see as the underlying struggle that's going on at all times in agriculture of any kind. Now, the good news is with veganism, if fewer and fewer people eat meat, that means that the land we need to feed the same number of human beings, to feed 1 billion people, let's say, we need dramatically less land. The land use to feed 1 billion vegans is dramatically lower than the land that we need to feed 1 billion meat eaters. This is well proven and well attested. You can get the stats out of a number of United Nations agencies, as well as local national studies from national governments around the world. The math is quite simple to do. The fundamental reason for that is that animals like pigs and cows don't just live for 5 minutes. They have to be raised up, fed a diet of grain before they're slaughtered themselves. The amount of water that's needed is dramatically, dramatically lower to sustain a population of 1 billion vegans as opposed to 1 billion meat eaters, and so on. So actually, the potential for rewilding, the potential to really expand the amount of area on the Earth's surface that's devoted to true animal welfare. Because true animal welfare is animals living in the wild, not animals living as a toy on your carpet. The potential is there as more and more people become vegan. We will have more and more resources just in the form of unused available land that we can devote to being wildlife reserves, to being habitat preservation areas to benefit animals. But in my way of thinking, that is the only way human beings benefit animals. We set up a fence, and the main purpose of that fence is not to keep the animals inside. It's to keep human beings out. It's to keep the hunters out. It's to keep anyone who wants to exploit the animals or cut down the trees, exploit the habitat out. Ultimately, we have to employ guards around every national park just to prevent illegal logging. This is a reality in third world countries. It's a reality within Canada. Everywhere, there's always economic pressure to start destroying the wild as soon as it's regenerated or as soon as you have an intact forest. But the idea that there is some kind of stark ethical difference between farming palm oil on a palm oil plantation and farming mangoes in the same climate is deeply, deeply flawed to me. And I don't see why vegans or meat eaters want to trade in this. Now, conversely, as Vegan Gains has just argued, there is a very, very deep ethical difference between eating beef and eating lentils or eating wheat or what have you. But in how we approach this problem, I think that vegans who want to imagine, either they think really about the ethics of the soul or they construe the ethical argument another way, you set yourself up for failure. If the reality of human beings needing to eat wheat, needing to eat rice, needing to eat beans, if that comes in as an unwanted distraction at the end of your line of thinking, I think you should turn around 180 degrees and put that first and foremost. The grim reality of the 21st century is that we live on a planet that is almost 100% subordinated to human needs and human conveniences, where almost the entire surface of the world exists for our exploitation, whether that's for the production of food, the production of electricity, the production of plastic items in factories, you name it. And the only thing you can contrast that to are the areas where, again, human laws, human governments, humans have sat down and projected their own values onto the map and decided, no, it has to stop somewhere. Somewhere we have to draw a dotted line and have armed guards and have some land that exists not for our benefit, but for the benefit of the forest itself, for the benefit of all the species of animals that live within that forest itself. That's where our domain ends and their domain begins. I think that is the ultimate ethical difference that we should base our arguments for veganism on, that we have to base a vegan philosophy on. And the result is a much more coherent and meaningful approach to vegan activism than these other approaches that, frankly, people fill up my email box with, arguing are superior to my own. So you can contrast this to an argument where people claim any oppression of animals is speciesism. Well, is it speciesism if you kill cockroaches inside your own apartment? A lot of vegans will say, well, that's an exception to the rule, but they still want to cling to the speciesist paradigm. Is it speciesism if every time you eat bread, you are paying someone to kill gophers and squirrels, ground squirrels, the other animals? Is it speciesism if every time you use edible oil like palm oil, you're indirectly paying for orangutans to be killed? And again, it's just as true of mangoes as it is of palm oil. There is no difference. The same species of animals like monkeys and orangutans will want to come onto a mango farm or a durian farm, and there are mean old farmers with rifles there to shoot the monkeys so they don't ruin the mango crop or the durian crop, whatever the example may be. You say, well, that's an exception to the rule, but still this speciesist paradigm, this is how we have to think of it, or still this idea that animals all have souls or have rights equivalent to human rights. I don't see it that way at all. I killed cockroaches just last night inside this apartment. I'm a vegan, but I don't want to be part of a political movement that's built on a lie. I don't want to be part of a religious movement that's built on a lie. And to some extent, when you get into these more spiritual approaches to veganism, it starts to resemble both. It starts to resemble a phony, pseudo-spiritual religious movement masquerading as a political movement that to me just rings hollow, and it does set us up for reputation by anyone who will just say, well, what about growing wheat? What about eating bread? For me, instead, I embrace entirely that these are human-created values, human-created laws, ultimately reflecting human responsibilities. Human civilization is destructive and in many ways ineluctably tragic. I can't live in this apartment without killing cockroaches, without occasionally killing mosquitoes. I think it would be better not to. Morally, it would be better if I could catch the cockroaches and put them outside without harming them. It would be better if we could grow wheat without killing all kinds of different mammals. But we can't, and we won't. What we can do is recognize our responsibility, our unique position as human beings in the 21st century, in a period of our history when there is no great untamed wilderness. Won't we have our little patches here and there of carefully controlled wilderness under human sovereignty, under human management, when our responsibility to the animals and to the planet is to make those decisions on their behalf, for their benefit and for ours, for where the exploitation is going to end, for where there are no more farms, for where there's no more factories, where the land exists for the sake of the animals themselves, and yes, indirectly, for the ecology, for the air, for the water that we all rely on.